start them. Good. To our JJC talks all along, and I'd like to welcome all of the new people here this evening. JJC will be 40 years young this year. And we started off back in 1986, and we became an affiliate group of the Baltimore Museum of Art. And JJC is named after Joshua Johnson. And Joshua Johnson is an 18th century African-American painter who lived and worked in Maryland. And he's documented as the earliest professional African-American artist. JJC connects Baltimore with the arts. And we'd like for you to join our organization and to become a member. We meet every second Thursday from September to June. And many of our meetings are in person, and many of them are virtual, like this evening. Our dues are $40 for individuals, $80 for dual membership. That's for two. We also have a student membership, which is $15. You do have to join the Baltimore Museum of Art also to become a member of JJC. So we also have on Facebook, we have a Facebook page, and we put information out almost daily about things that are happening in the Baltimore area in reference to arts and culture. We try to keep people informed in reference to what's happening. You can also go on to YouTube to view any of the artist talks that we've previously had. Now, what else I want you to know is that we're having our celebration this June. We're celebrating our 40th year anniversary, and details will be posted soon about that. Now, let's get ready to listen to our presenter this evening. I'm sure you will enjoy it. Thanks, and thank you for showing up today.
Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we begin, a reminder that you are welcome to contribute questions in the chat. Following Sam's talk, he will be joined by BMA trustee and former JJC chair Antoinette Peel for a Q&A, which contributed to a Q&A during which contributed questions will be shared. We're honored to be joined tonight by the award-winning filmmaker Sam Pollard. Over a career spanning more than 40 years, Pollard's work in documentary and narrative film has covered topics ranging from the 1963 bombing of the 16th Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and the effects of Hurricane Katrina to the stories of Zora Neale Hurston, August Wilson, Sammy Davis Jr., among many others. His work has been nominated for an Academy Award and received multiple Emmys, among other accolades. Sam Pollard, thank you for joining us this evening.
It's my pleasure. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to be invited to do a talk today about documentary filmmaking and how it intersects with my career as an African American filmmaker. As was mentioned, I've done many films, first as an editor back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then in the 2000s. I've done lots of films as a director and producer. My career started back in 1971 when I was had the opportunity to be in the film and television workshop in New York City through the public television station WNET. And at that point, I didn't know I was going to be in the film business. It was just I was looking for some kind of hobby to do when I was in college, where I was studying marketing. And very fortunate for me was that program really lit a fire under me and excited me and wanted me to really get into the film business. And I really focused as a young 21-year-old on editing. And I really got this real sort of bug in my bonnet, bee in my bonnet, I should say, about becoming an editor. And I was fortunate that after that 1-year program, which was 2 nights a week, where I had professionals come in and teach us the business of filmmaking, I was an apprentice editor on a low-budget feature film that has become a classic in the independent cinema world. Title was Ganja and Hess, directed by a gentleman named Bill Gunn, who had been a playwright and an actor and became a director. But also the other fortunate thing that happened to me in that experience, working on that film for like 7 months, was I had an opportunity to work with a gentleman named Victor Koneski, who took me under his wing and basically taught me the pros and cons, the ins and outs of how you become an editor, both using your imagination and working with directors and producers. And he also introduced me to the world of documentaries, because up to that point, when I started to really get interested in editing, I had this notion that I wanted to be an editor of feature films. I had grown up watching the old Hollywood films with people like Burt Lancaster and Barbara Stanwyck and Ava Gardner and Kirk Douglas and Robert Mitchum and John Wayne. So I thought I wanted to be a feature film editor, but Victor introduced me to the world of documentaries. And one thing about being a documentary editor is that you really become sort of the surrogate director. Because with documentaries, there's no scripts, there's no actors, and it's really real life, real people, real events. And you have to learn to be able to take this disparate material, interviews, archival footage, footage that's just shot, with people in their living situations, and give it a rhyme or reason and a story arc, a narrative story arc. And I found that, quite honestly, extremely empowering. It really just gave me a sense of confidence and a level that I could make a film. It took a while. I didn't learn that immediately after working as Victor's apprentice and then his assistant, and then later as his co-editor. But as I edited and re-edited and edited and re-edited over the next 3 years, from the age of 22 to 25, I began to develop that muscle that gave me the level of confidence to be able to cut documentaries. And I was fortunate that Victor was such a sharing individual that by the time I was 27, I had an opportunity to co-edit with him a documentary titled Just Crazy About Horses, about the Eastern horse world. And it was a powerful, fascinating film that had lots of challenges that we had to overcome, which we did. And I think it turned out to be a really powerful, interesting film. It was directed by 2 gentlemen, one named Tim Lovejoy, the other one named Joe Wemple. And from that point on, I became what was called a freelancer, where you would go out and try to find work. But it was a freelancer in the documentary field. And I worked on a children's series called 321 Contact. Then I had an opportunity to cut some low-budget feature films, because it was interesting that even though I fell in love with documentaries, I had an opportunity to go back and work on some dramatic films. And I worked with another gentleman who became an important mentor to me named George Bowers. And George was a gentleman who had cut a lot of feature films, and he became a director also. So in 1980, I edited a film for him titled Body and Soul that starred a gentleman named Leon Isaac Kennedy and his wife Jane Kennedy. It was a boxing movie. And then I went on and I edited another film for George called Private Resort that had a young Johnny Depp and a young Rob Morrow as the leads. It was a comedy film. It wasn't a great film, but it was a film that gave me an opportunity to practice my craft. And the one thing I have always learned about editing films, both be it feature films or documentaries, is that you learn your craft. You learn to refine your craft. And anybody who's out there who's looking to get into the film business, or even specifically into editing, You should just really watch movies. I always say to young students or aspiring filmmakers, watch films, watch lots of films, all kinds of films, documentaries, dramatic films, TV shows, comedies, because you'll see how people refine the craft. And the other thing I would always say to people is that when I watched films, I would not just watch them once. It was Alfred Hitchcock or Quentin Tarantino or Spike Lee. I'd watch these films over and over again just to study the craft, study how the editing put the films together. And then, there's lots of books about editing. There's a book called In the Blink of an Eye, written by Walter Murch, who was a great editor for both, Francis Coppola and Anthony Minghella, and he talks about editing. There's a lot of books, Paul, the books about the art of editing. So, to me, it's always been about loving to make documentaries and loving the craft of telling stories through editing, and something that I still am completely engaged in, not even though I'm now a director. So after I did these low budget feature films in the early 80s, I was back into documentaries, and I cut a film with Victor that has become, in the documentary world, in the hip hop and the graffiti world, a very well respected film. It was called Style Wars, STYLE, Style Wars, about hip hop and graffiti in the 80s in New York City. And it was directed by a gentleman named Tony Silver and produced by a gentleman named Henry Chalfin, who brought this material to Victor and myself in 1982, which we spent over a year editing this film. And again, it was engaging, frustrating, challenging, but eventually it turned out to be a very powerful, powerful film and a powerful document that looked at New York in the 80s and the hip hop scene and the graffiti scene, and the challenges that these young artists had to deal with and dealing with the city government that was led by Mayor Ed Koch at the time. So again, it was learning the craft and experiencing, the experience of life, of people's stories. And that's one of the things I've always found about documentaries that I love, is that you learn so much. I learned about graffiti. I learned about hip hop. I did a documentary about August Wilson. I had to go watch all of his plays. I did a documentary about Sammy Davis Jr. I had an opportunity to see all of his work, and then I was also into jazz. So I had an opportunity in 1986, 85 to meet a great jazz musician, drummer, percussionist, composer named Max Roach. And I was working on a film about Langston Hughes, and there was a sequence in the film where Langston played a drum solo to a Langston Hughes poem. And I cut that sequence together. And after I cut that sequence, I turned to my director, a gentleman named St. Clair Bourne, another mentor. And I should just mention, I had three powerful, important mentors in my career over the last 30, 40 years. First was Victor Konevsky, who taught me how to edit, taught me how to be creative and imaginative. The second was George Bowers, who taught me how to be not only a good editor, but be professional and bring a professional sort of ethic to editing and filmmaking. And the third was St. Clair Bourne, a documentary filmmaker, African-American, who basically made me understand that we had to tell our stories, the stories of the African-American experience, and shouldn't shy away from that. So when I turned to Saint, after I cut this sequence on Max Roach, I said to Saint, somebody should make a film about Max Roach. And Saint turned to me and said, you should make it. And I was startled, because up to this point, I had not thought about directing at all. I just wanted to be an editor. And with Saint's sort of support and pushing me, he introduced me to Max. And then he brought together myself and the associate producer on the Langston Hughes film, a young woman named Dolores Elliott. And he paired us together with her going to be the producer and me the director. We were able to raise some money, and we started this journey of documenting Max. Now, this was in 1986, 87, and it took me almost 30 years to complete this film, with stops and starts, with feeling ambivalent about finishing it. Wasn't sure this was the right film for me as a director. I didn't think it was good enough. But unfortunately, after about 20-something years, I was able to get involved with a gentleman named Ben Shapiro, who became my co-director, who really pushed me to get this film done, to finish it. So I'm going to share you just a little bit of this film because it was not only about a jazz musician who I loved, but it was about a man who was also an activist who had a personal perspective that was similar to St. Clair, that he wasn't just a jazz musician. He was a musician of color, a musician who understood his African-American roots. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you right now.
You consider this music as a weapon?
You mean as a weapon in the fight against discrimination and things like that? Sometimes the music is used, say, to make people feel happy and joy. But on some occasions, we do use the music as a weapon to against man's inhumanity toward man.
It is with great pleasure that I present to you Mr. Max Roach.
Well, jazz is, to me, a nickname. To me, it's synonymous to nigga and things like that. That's a proper name for African-American instrumental music. It never was a name that we as musicians gave to it. It was a name that just was given to it.
So you're not a jazz musician?
No, I'm an African-American musician, and that's the kind of music that I play. Or I attempt to play.
The Max Roach archive at the Library of Congress is extensive. Stills, audio recordings. Oh, I've seen this one. He knew that to document his legacy would be very important. These are the 80s. Mm-hmm. Check this out. I began this film in 1987, so it's 35 years. That's a long journey. In 1983, I was editing a documentary about the poet Langston Hughes. And one of the sequences was Max performing to one of Langston Hughes' poems. Seeing Max Roach sit behind a drum set, he had a regal quality about it. It was like no wasted motion, just wonderful, man. And I remember saying, somebody should do a film on Max Roach. I had never directed anything. I was just an editor. But in 1987, I was able to do my first sit-down on-camera interview with Max at his house up on Central Park West.
I got the cameras on me, and Sam is shooting, telling us where to go, and Juan has got his camera on me now.
And we shot Max and his wonderful band, Bim Boom, in a rehearsal session, performing Monk's tunes. And unbeknownst to me, Ben Shapiro, a fellow filmmaker, was doing audio recordings with Max Roach. Ben was a drummer, and he had been studying Max's music and this book that had many exercises that had Max's approach to the drums.
The drum set itself, Ben, is uniquely American innovation.
So I learned that as I was shooting Max Roach, Ben was doing a long audio interview where Max documented his whole life story.
I'm into the whole political thing. To me, everything has that kind of meaning to it, you know.
Now, after 3 decades, we're finishing this film to tell the story of Max Roach.
Really? Mm-hmm.
So that was me in my film that took 35 years to be correct myself, to make. And I always say this was my labor of love. I mean, this was a film that I was in my heart that I wanted to do, and I finally got it finished with the help of my co-director, Ben Shapiro. But at the same time, as I was doing, preparing this film and starting the production of this film, I had also had an opportunity to work on the series Eyes on the Prize, and it was specifically Eyes on the Prize too, for Henry Hampton and his company Blackside in Boston. And that was a real baptism of fire, because I had never really sat and directed in interviews and figured out structure without, being just the editor. So I was now going to be a co-director with a woman named Sheila Bernard. And it was, I have to say very clearly, it was a eye-opening experience for me to be in the editing room, be on location, shooting interviews, asking questions, trying to get the material that would go into the edit room. And it wasn't easy, but I was focused on doing it, and it was important to me, to make it happen. And it was the beginning of another phase of my career. I mean, as a documentary editor, I had learned, like a lot of documentary editors, to poo-poo documentary directors who came in with footage and didn't have a clue how to put the story together, and then I would save them. But now that the shoe, as they say, was on the other foot. And now I had to figure out how to make the material that I shot come together in the edit room. And fortunately, I found a wonderful editor, because I didn't edit it myself. I found a wonderful editor named Betty Ciccarelli, who came in, who was feisty and then tough. And she forced me to try some different things editorially with my co-director, Sheila. And we turned into two very, very interesting films. One called Two Societies, that looked at the civil rights movement in Detroit during the 1967 rebellion, or race riot as it was called then, and Chicago, and Cicero in Chicago, where Dr. King struggled mightily to break the back of, housing segregation. And the other film was about, called Ain't Gonna Shuffle No More. It was about Muhammad Ali, who refused to go into the service, and what happened to him when he refused to go into the service, losing his belt, his title, and had some other wonderful stories in it. So 85, 86 was a very sort of important period in my career, as both working on Eyes on the Prize 2, beginning a documentary on Max Roach, and it sort of took me into this next level of my career. So can we go to the next slide that we put into the situation here? So I'm going to not talk about this one yet, but by 88, I had an opportunity to work with Spike Lee, who hired me after I did Eyes on the Prize, and as I started production on Max, hired me to dip my toe in editing dramatic films again. I had done that 2 films earlier, Private Resort and Body and Soul. And then in 88, Spike hired me to direct Mo Better Blues with Denzel Washington and Wesley Snipes, which had originally been titled A Love Supreme, based on John Coltrane's seminal album. So I edited that film for Spike, and then I edited, Jungle Fever, and then I did Clockers, I did Juice, I did Surviving the Game for Ernest Dickerson and Juice for Ernest Dickerson, Girl 6 for Spike. And so the middle 90s, I was really focused on editing dramatic films. But as always, my love for documentaries, I went back to that because, again, that documentary form, I always felt as an editor challenged me more, in terms of shaping stories, shaping rhythms and arc. And the thing as an editor that you always have to remember is that it's not just figuring out how to shape the narrative, but it's how to give it pace and rhythm so the things feel really engaging, so you keep the audience's attention, and again, I would study lots of films to see how film directors and film editors pace the sequence or pace the whole film, be it a John Ford film or a Hitchcock film, and then it was the documentaries of the Maisels or D.A. Pennebaker. How did these filmmakers, both in the documentary world and in the feature film world, structure and edit and pace these films? Which to me, is, again, part of my process is always to be open to learning as much as I can about the film process. But by the 2000s, I started to focus more on my directing career and less on editing. And even though I was still editing, I started to direct more. And in 2011, I had an opportunity to get involved with a film with a gentleman named Doug Blackman, who had put together, had written a book. I think I'm trying to see if I can show this one. He had written a book titled "Slavery by Another Name," and I optioned the book. The book was optioned by a public television station in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And when they were looking for a director, I had met Doug previously, before the book had been published, and he asked me to direct the film. And it was a great experience, because this film was not only a film that looked at how slavery was dealt with after the Civil War. There was still a notion of slavery going on, but how it impacted Black people after the Emancipation Proclamation, when Black men were being arrested, Black women were being arrested, put into prisons, having to work. This was another function of slavery. And we were able to shoot a bunch of interviews in New York City. And we went down to Alabama and we shot recreations to tell the story. And it was one of these very important, powerful experiences for me, that moved me a lot in terms of understanding our history and our stories. Again, experience that, you could never sort of deny, as a filmmaker. So again, it was for me not just to tell stories, but to tell the stories of the African American experience, which is, I always like to say, is a part of the American experience. So in 2011, 2012, I became more of a director and less of an editor. Even though I was still editing, I was starting to direct more. So it was Slavery by Another Name. And then I had an opportunity to do this film about Sammy Davis Jr. And I was saying to someone the other day was, in the last 12, 15 years of my career, I've been very fortunate to work on films that really speak to me, not only in terms of the African-American experience, but also because these were subjects that I grew up with, and I really dealt with. And Sammy Davis Jr. was somebody I had followed as a young man. I had seen him on the Ed Sullivan Show. I'd seen him in the Rat Pack movies with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Peter Lawford, from Ocean's 11 to Robin and the Seven Hoods, to Sergeant's 3, all of these films. And also knew that he was a great entertainer. He was a well-rounded entertainer who was a singer, a dancer, a mime who could do impressions. So when I was asked to do this film in 2016, 2017, it was something I was so excited about doing. I so looked forward to it. Again, finding all the elements to tell the story. And the one great thing we had about this Sammy Davis Jr. film was that when we were doing research, which is an important part of the documentary process, the research part, finding stills and footage and audio, we were given entree to the Sammy Davis Jr. estate, and we found all this wonderful audio that he had done in preparation for a sequel to his book, Yes, I Can. And we used a lot of this audio to shape and tell his story. It showed you how complicated he was, as a man of color during the period of Jim Crow and segregation, and how he was challenged and had to face all these issues as a man of color, Black man, in America at the time, at the same time he was striving to be a successful entertainer. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of this film also. Somehow I have a little problem today showing these clips. I'm not sure why. I'm not going to show this clip. This is a difficult time today with these clips, but it was a film that was important to me, and it got a lot of positive response. It was shown in a series called American Masters, which was a series that had been on PBS for many years that documented great people like Sammy Davis Jr., like August Wilson, and so many others, and like Max Roach, which premiered on American Masters a couple of years ago. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is a film that I did for HBO called Black Art in the Absence of Light. In around 2019, I was approached by HBO and a producer named Jackie Glover and the executive producer Henry Louis Gates to do a film that looked at the African-American experience in the artistic world. And one of our advisors was a lady who runs the Studio Museum named Thelma Golden. And Thelma was, very active in making sure that African-American artists got their due. And so when Henry Louis Gates and I approached her about how to tell the story, she suggested we reach out to a gentleman named David Driscoll, who had put together an exhibit in the 70s that focused on African-American artists of the 20th century. People like Elizabeth Catlett, Jacob Lawrence, Romare Bearden, and so many other ones, Charles White, so many other great artists. And so then his exhibit, which was very successful in the 70s, became the frame to tell our story about Black art and to speak to Black artists today and how that exhibit informed and influenced their own work in this present time. So we talked to people like Carrie James Marshall, Carrie Mae Weems, Theaster Gates, so many artists that we focused on to tell the story. And it turned out to be, again, an educational experience, a learning experience where I got to tell our stories and to really spend time with these artists. We traveled to Chicago, we traveled to Atlanta, we traveled to Los Angeles, we traveled to New York City, and spent a lot of time with all these different artists and watching them work and then interviewing them. And we also interviewed art historians and curators about these African-American artists, and it turned into an experience that I will treasure till, for forever, because again, as a filmmaker, you learn so much, particularly as a documentary filmmaker, you learn so much when you tell these stories about people and their experiences, So again, it was either be it Max Roach or Sammy Davis Jr., August Wilson, or Black artists like Carrie James Marshall and Carrie Mae Weems, and Theaster Gates, it's an experience. It's an education. It's a learning process where you learn about all these different things and different people. I'm going to see if we can get this clip to work. I don't know what's going on. Oh, we're having a real problem here today. These clips. Oh, well. Well, hopefully, if you have Canopy or if you have an opportunity to go on YouTube, you can see Black art in the absence of light, because that's where it can be seen. I'm going to try to see if I can get it on there on YouTube. Bear with me. Everything is. I'm not sure why this is happening here today. Well, I'm gonna continue. Let's go to the next clip. The next slide. This film, The League, was a film that I had an opportunity to work on about 2 years ago. But 6 years before that, a gentleman named Brian Motley reached out to me and told me the story of his dad, Bob Motley, who had been a Negro League umpire. And the people he met as he was umpiring Negro League games, people like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, and others. And he wanted to make a film about his dad and his experiences in the Negro Leagues. And so we, like lots of documentaries, you always have to figure out how to raise the money. And we went around to different sources trying to raise the money, and it was hard. It took a while. And you could say like 6 years it took. And we were finally able to get Questlove involved as the executive producer. And he came on board, which enabled us to get other people to come in with funding to make the film happen. And then we had, like again, I said earlier, the big important thing is to have research, archival researchers. We've brought on a wonderful archival researcher who went and started to just find archival footage, stills, audio of all this period of the Negro Leagues from the 1920s up to the 1950s. And we were also able to interview a bunch of historians who were diehard Negro League fans, and they love the Negro Leagues. So we spent a lot of time in Kansas, in Alabama, where there was an old baseball field, Negro League baseball field for the Birmingham Barons. We went to the Negro League Museum in Kansas, and we shot. And we were able to do recreations for this one, like I had done with Slavery by Another Name, recreations, of this period of the Negro League players. And we were able to cast some young African-American baseball players who could play, could bat, could field, and to help tell the story. And the other element we brought to this film was animation, which was something I had started to use in 2016 on a film called Two Trains Running, that was about the search for two phenomenal blues musicians, Skip James and Son House in Mississippi. And it was a story that was also told about the civil rights movement in '64, when young white students went down to Mississippi to fight for voting rights for African Americans. So that was the first time that I had an opportunity to use animation in a film. So I was able to do that again in this film, The League. About bringing the animation, bringing recreations, have archival footage. Some of it that was provided by the fantastic poet named Quincy Troupe, whose father had been whose name was also Quincy Troupe, who had been a Negro League ball player, catcher back in the Negro Leagues. So again, all these experiences for me as a documentary editor, as a documentary filmmaker, has been also a learning experience. It's also been an opportunity to share the African-American experience, again, as I said, which is also the American experience with lots of different people, So, I have told someone the other day also that here I am almost 50 years in this filmmaking business as an editor, as a director, as a producer, and the kind of curiosity and the kind of love and passion I had for the business when I was a young man of 22, I still have as an older gentleman, whose years have passed. And I still find talking to people like you, making films, telling our stories, such an important part of, my experience, as an African American. Let's go to the next slide. I think we have one more slide. Is this the last slide? Now, this film, MLK FBI, had a really interesting journey. I was approached by a gentleman named Ben Hadeen, who had been the producer on the film I mentioned earlier, Two Trains Running. And he had read this book by a historian named David Garrow that looked at how Dr. King had been surveilled and monitored and watched and taped, audio taped by the FBI. And after he read the book, he reached out to me and said, I think this could be a powerful, powerful film. And I read the book. And I thought the same thing. I said, wow, this could be a great film. So Ben optioned the book. Then we reached out to Dave Garrow, who was teaching in Pittsburgh. And we went out to Pittsburgh with a camera crew. And we spent all day with him, shooting him, interviewing him about the genesis of the book, what he found out as he was writing the book, the information that was in the archive that had been recorded by the FBI. And we were able to go to the Freedom of Information Act to get, access to the transcripts of this audio that had been recorded of King involved with other members of his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and also the fact that he had these extramarital affairs with women that no one knew about. And building the film with archival footage and interviews from people who were close to King, like Clarence Jones and Andy Young, and also some historians who were very familiar with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and Dr. King's life. We told this whole story with archival footage and stills and some very impressionistic recreations. And, we didn't know at the time that this was going to be such an important film. And knowing full well what Donald Trump is talking about releasing the tapes, this makes this film today even more relevant than it was when we did it back 3 or 4 years ago. And a powerful story that shows the complexity of this great man. And it's one of the things I always say as a filmmaker, telling these stories of Sammy Davis Jr., August Wilson, or Dr. King. I'm never trying to paint a lily white picture. I want to show the complexity of these individuals. And to me, that makes them more well-rounded and more human, and also much more interesting dramatically. So if you haven't had an opportunity to see any of these films, be it Slavery by Another Name, Blackguard in the Absence of Light, The League, Sammy Davis Jr., or MLK FBI, these films will show layers and levels of complexity about this in their who they were and the experiences they had. Do we have another slide? I think this might be the last slide. Oh, this film, Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power, is a film that I co-directed with my longtime colleague, first my apprentice editor, then my associate editor, then my co-editor, then a director. Co-director is Gita Ganbir. And this was a film that, as I was telling someone, I initially refused to do because I was sort of feeling like I had done enough civil rights films. But Gita was very persuasive, and she got me to get involved with this film. And it was an opportunity to tell the story of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was based in the South, but had been a part of, the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965 with Dr. King. And as they were leaving, going from Selma to Montgomery, they got focused on a little community in Lowndes County where the Black people were trying to get the right to vote. And folks like Stokely Carmichael, who ran SNCC at the time, and other members of SNCC became very engaged and involved with the Black folks in Lowndes County to get them the right to vote. And we tell that story. And we tell the story that they, in figuring out how to get the vote, they took the symbol of the Black Panther as their credo to sort of say, this is who we are. And the interesting thing about this story was that the Black Panther logo that they used became something that two young men in Oakland, California took up and formed their own organization. These two young men were Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. And the symbol became the symbol for the Black Panther Party, which, if you don't know about, was a very radical group of young men in 1969 who really challenged Americans' notion that we could bear arms, in resisting the horrors of segregation, horrors of American capitalism. And so this story, Lowndes County, was, I think, an opportunity for people for the first time to see how important an organization like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was, in knowing that there were other organizations besides Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or CORE, that were out there fighting for civil rights and then Black empowerment, because the gentleman, Stokely Carmichael, was the one who coined that phrase, Black Power. We want Black Power. We want Black Power. And this was, again, it was, as I said at the beginning, it was a film I wasn't initially interested in doing, but I'm so glad I had an opportunity to work on it with my colleague and my partner, Gita. And it turned into a very, very, very important and powerful film. I don't know if anyone's opened it up for questions in the chat, but I'm open to answer any questions that you might have.
Hello, Mr. Pollard. My name is Antoinette Peel, and I'm going to be facilitating the Q&A. Although I don't see anything in the chat just yet, I do have some questions, but most importantly, I want to thank you.
My pleasure,
Antoinette. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everything that you've done. I've had the opportunity to see some of your films, and the connection to you now is super special to me right now because of so many things that you've done that I've actually watched and absolutely relate to. But I want to read you something that I read when I looked you up. It said, your legacy and impact, if that's okay, before I start the questions, because this point in time is so important for where we are in society. And what it says about you is Sam Pollard's career spans decades, influencing both narrative and documentary filmmaking. His work as an editor helped shape some of the most important Black cinema of the late 20th century, while his contributions as a producer and director have ensured that key historical stories and document it with depth and authenticity. His films continue to educate and inspire, shedding light on untold histories and social injustices. Now, that's quite a summary for the length of work you've done. And I did put in the chat on YouTube your IMDb, which has a series of your films and trailers that people can actually see. So the ones you didn't get a chance to share here, people could actually go and take a look at. So I thank you for this legacy of bringing to light some of the unknown, some of the things that we didn't get in school, that we have an opportunity to see through your eyes. And so some of my questions are around the various hats that you've worn. So one of them is editing and visual storytelling. And you touched on this a bit and used actually some of the same words. It's, as an editor, you've helped shape the rhythm and tone of many films. How do you approach editing to enhance the visual and emotional storytelling?
Well, that's a good question. That's a great question. Every time you sit down at an editing machine and you're given material to put together. So, for example, in that Max Roach film, the opening that you saw where Max is talking to the French reporter and he's asking Max that question. Then we cut to a drum solo of Max and then back to Max saying, when the guy says, what kind of filmmaker or what kind of musician are you? He says, I'm not a jazz musician. I'm an African-American musician. Now, when we originally edited that opening sequence, we didn't even use that material. It was completely different. But then myself and my co-director, Ben Shapiro, realized that we weren't making the point that we were trying to make, that Max was just more than a jazz musician. So we went back and we found that voiceover in that interview where he says, I'm not a jazz musician, I'm an African-American musician. And then we went back to another solo of Max playing. And then what was interesting too, the sequence that we have in the film now where you see me talking about it's taking me all these years to do the film and then introduce Ben Shapiro, that wasn't in the first cuts we had. We didn't even have that in the first cuts. It was our executive producer, Michael Cantor, who said, maybe you guys should think about having the audience understand where this film came from. What was the genesis of this film? So then Ben and I talked about it and we thought about it. Initially, we rejected the idea. We said, that doesn't make sense. We don't put ourselves in the film. Then we thought about it again and we said, maybe we could do it. So then Ben started to shape a sequence where I was able to find some footage of me as a young man in my 30s. He found some stills that he had shot. He found some other audio that he had of Max, talking to Max, and we reshaped it. And then I went to a recording studio and I did the audio. We wrote it out and I did this audio. I did 7 takes just to make it feel spontaneous, to make it come to life. And then Ben was able to go in the editing room and shape it and give it that rhythm and pace. And this is how the process works. You have to take the elements and you have to think sort of creatively, what am I trying to say with these elements? Are these the elements that are necessary to put this sequence together? If not, where do I find the elements that do that? And that's part of this process I was talking about, research. Research is such a valuable component in making documentaries. And we're able to find so much. And one of the fortunate things about the Max Roach film and the Sammy Davis film and even the Dr. King film is that they had been documented everywhere. So we were able to go and find lots of stills, lots of archival footage to tell these stories. And that's important to have.
Very good. Okay, so there's actually a question in the chat I'm going to switch to, so I'm going to bounce back and forth. Sure. I'm curious, this is from Andrea. I'm curious how you found your mentors and did they find you? And thank you, I really respect your work. This is from
the three mentors I mentioned, Victor Koneski, George Bowers, and St. Clair Bourne. Victor found me. He was looking for an African-American apprentice for this film that was basically done with mostly a black director, black cinematographer. Most of the crew is black, and he was a Jewish gentleman. So he felt he had a responsibility to bring on a black apprentice. So he found me. George Bowers, I happened to be, after I finished a couple of jobs in my early 20s, I was going around different post-production buildings with my resume, with my one film on it, looking for work. And I happened to knock on this door, and this young black man named Kevin Lee, who was George's assistant, opened the door, and he introduced me to George, who was cutting a film titled Countdown at Cassini that was directed by Ossie Davis. And George sat me down and talked to me, and he didn't hire me that day, but he recommended me to work on a film, a series of short films about the first 3 black mayors in America: Tom Bradley, Coleman Young in Detroit, and Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. And it was being directed by one of Gordon Parks' sons, you know. And from that introduction to George, he later on hired me as an assistant editor on the film, and we became really good friends. And then the third person, St. Clair Bourne, George introduced me to St. when I was looking for work after I finished working on that film Body and Soul. Said that St. Clair was looking for an editor to do this film about Chicago blues musicians. So I've been, the way you find a mentor is you find people who you reach out to and they speak to you, or somebody wants you to work with them. I mean, and I've mentored lots of people myself. And I always say when I do sessions like this, you know, have your people reach out to me. Anybody who's on these chats, reach out to me, give them my email, and sure, I'll talk to them. You know, I'm always looking to help young people get a leg up in the industry.
Very nice. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to jump to another question. I'm not seeing in the chat, so I'm going to jump to another one. How do you think about framing and composition when working with interview subjects versus constructing historical moments?
That's a good question, too. Every film, I have to decide what are the elements that help us tell the story. Is it going to be interview-based? Is it going to have recreations? Is it going to have animation? Now, for example, I mentioned the film Black Art in the Absence of Light. Now, before I shot that film, with my cinematographer, Henry Adebonojo, we went and shot tests. And what were these tests? We shot tests about what was the color palette we're going to use to shoot each interview. Were we going to use a different background for the artist and the historians, which we decided that we would shoot the artists in their art space. We would shoot the historians with a backdrop. And then what kind of backdrop were we talking about? Should it be a black backdrop? Should it be a blue backdrop? What color backdrop? So we came up with three or four different textures of backdrops for the historians. Then when we were going to shoot the artists in their space, and we're going to shoot what we call just verite with them at work, how are we going to shoot it? We're going to put it on sticks. We're going to shoot it handheld. And we shot it handheld, you know. So you're thinking about it. And right now I'm doing a film. I'm in post-production on the film about the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. King was assassinated. And besides shooting it with the regular video cameras that's available, we shot a lot of the exteriors of the Lorraine Motel, which is now a museum, the National Civil Rights Museum. We shot it Super 8. So you have film quality. So we have both regular video and we shot Super 8 because I wanted that texture in telling the story. So you always, every time I'm doing a film, I'm trying to consider what is the visual palette that I want to create in helping to tell the story.
Very good. Another question I'm interested in. Your documentaries often use a striking juxtaposition of image and sound. Can you share an example of how you've used visuals to reshape or enhance a narrative?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I mean, if you go back and you watch, if the audience people have an opportunity to watch Slavery by Another Name, you'll see throughout the film this juxtaposition of interviews with the recreations that we shot of people who were in chains, you know, working on the chain gang, the sound effects that we use to heighten the drama and the tension of being on the chain gang, you know, or them walking in the swamp. We shot this footage with these 4 young African Americans. We put them in period clothes, you know, the striped shirts and pants. We put chains on them, you know, and then we enhanced it orally with sound effects. We shot some of it in slow motion, you know, but we would enhance it all. We had them chopping wood. We would enhance that with sound effects too. So it's always trying to figure out how to marry both the visual and the oral and heighten the drama. Because I'm a great believer with the documentary. I'm trying not to make it feel like just a regular documentary. I'm trying to heighten it dramatically. And what tools to have at hand to do that, you know? And in this case with slavery, I had the tools of the recreations, shooting in slow motion, you know, sound design, you know, chain gang effects, you know, chopping wood effects, all those effects to enhance the drama. So it just doesn't feel like, okay, I just showed you some shots. No, I'm going to enhance it orally.
So, okay, you've collaborated with some of the most visually distinctive directors. What have you learned about the relationship between editing and cinematography from working with directors like Spike Lee or anyone?
Well, you know, the thing about working with Spike and Ernest Dickerson and other directors is that you learn to respect their creative process. You learn to respect their sense of authorship, you know, how they want to tell the story. And when I was editing, you want to try to make sure you're in sync with their vision. It's not about me having my vision. It's about being in sync with their vision. And what I do in the edit, how does it enhance what they want to say orally, visually, you know? And both of these men, Spike and Ernest, and even George Bowers, who I worked with on a couple of feature films, they all had a particular point of view about how they want to see the world. And that's the thing you want to remember as a filmmaker. How do these filmmakers, these directors, want you to see their world, you know? And what do you bring to the table to enhance, you know, their sense of the world they want to see?
So are you extracting that as you're working together and you're starting to catch or see how they flow as the process is going? I mean, you kind of know what the story's about, but it's almost like this orchestra that everybody has a part to play, and somehow you're getting to the end game, which is whatever the visual needs to feel like, sound like, and then you get to the emotional component, which is what the viewer would experience having watched, listened, and learned from. Is that how that works?
Yeah, that's how it works, because you're right. I like that term, orchestra. You're a member of the orchestra, like the sound designer, like the colorist, you know, like the composer. We're all members of the orchestra trying to enhance and create and shape the story according to what the conductor / director wants, you know, and that's the job. That's a great term. You know, sometimes, like, you know, I'm not just an editor, I'm an arranger.
Right. Yeah. Because then you think about how you work together, then creates an emotional moment or experience throughout the piece or the project for the viewer.
Yeah,
you're trying to experience it. Yeah, and then you have this. It feels like sometimes when you're watching, especially documentary films, which I happen to really love, there's this introduction of the person based on either an upfront something that kind of jolts you into knowing them, and then the steps that bring you through to really getting to know how you got to that first setting. But there's also this learning that you're going through, and then there's this feeling about what's happening to the person or in the experience that you start to build this emotional content from watching this. And then thinking about how you as an editor and director and producer, all of these in one, wearing a specific hat to get me there as the viewer. I mean, is that experience with the group? I mean, you're bringing your perspective and everybody else's. I mean, how does that?
Well, that's why I always say that the thing about the filmmaking process is a collaborative medium. And if you don't have good collaborators, you don't have a chance of making a really good film. The more you are involved in working with great collaborators, the better chance you have of making a film that's going to stand the test of time, you know.
And then looking at your body of work, I mean, there's a lot on IMDb. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, it lists all the films, everything you've worked on, and the roles you have with trailers. There's a lot of very, very, which is why that summary says what it does about you, very significant work there that really influences and shapes our history, not just from the point in time that you made them, but today. Because there's this historical context. Right. I mean, and for those who don't know or have not had an opportunity to go look, I am highly recommending you go look at those, because there are things there, there's work there that really is relevant today, even though you did it in 1989 or 1976. I mean, those things are still today. So we can't just act like it's history when it's very, very, very present.
Thank you, Antoinette. You're absolutely right.
And that's the beauty of even being able to talk to someone like you who's actually seen that. I mean, you've gone through, I'm sure the research itself is a lot to go through and listen to sound bites, see visuals, see still shots, and then put the story together so that the rest of us can learn about that person or that event or that point in time.
Well, that's why I was saying it's so important. You know, one of the things that's been such a wonderful experience for me is that every time I make one of these documentaries, I learn something else. You know, I learned something about slavery and post-slavery. I learned something about the Negro Leagues. I learned something about Black artists like Kerry James Marshall and David Driscoll and Carrie Mae Weems and Carol Walker. You know, I learned something about Sammy Davis Jr. that I didn't know. You know, so it's both. You know, for me, it's both exhilarating and just so educational. You know, because I loved history when I was in school, but now I'm having an opportunity to shape history when I make these films.
Yeah, and I think also what's so important about the work that you do, because I also know you've got some projects that are like coming up or pending, and we can talk a bit about those if you don't mind. But it's just for those who may not be readers, who may not want to sit and read a book about an individual. There's a lot about history you can get through documentary film.
That's exactly right.
Actually taking that and really putting yourself in it, like the context of what people are experiencing at a point in time through the work you've done, really can be set in modern day. And the connections are so strong between now and 40 years ago that
I know.
And you feel the progress, but yet you see the reality of what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with everything happening today, it is really important to even preserve these stories in ways that they can continue to be told for what they do bring forward. And I cannot encourage enough with the audience watching, listening, that you go look at that work and actually see what it is that our community has done based on and through the lens of someone like you who has been able to preserve that for people who are not able to tell you how they felt or what is happening, but putting it together the way you do makes it just such a powerful statement at a point in time that does not die. It continues to live on, and that is something we're forever grateful for. Well, a few more questions, if you don't mind. I'm going to go ask a few more questions. And one is because I want to talk about advice for visual artists and filmmakers. You gave some, which was watch movies and keep watching. That's one of the things you asked, advice for visual artists looking to transition into film editing or directing. Are there other things other than having them watch films and just keep watching?
Well, you know, the other thing that I do is every time there's something about a filmmaker or a film's aesthetic, I read a book. You know, I still love to read books. I'm reading a book now. I just picked out a book I had in my library for years that I finally decided to look at it, called The Selected Letters of Elia Kazan, great director of On the Waterfront and Streetcar Named Desire. And, you know, it's again, my curiosity level is still very high. So besides watching films, besides reading books, you know, go to museums. I mean, culturally, you should always keep yourself open to other things. I mean, I loved going to the museums, like Baltimore Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, you know, because I love to look at the great painters and the great masters and understand what Picasso was doing in terms of his color palette, you know, or, you know, Elizabeth Catlett or Carrie James Marshall. I was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art with my wife a couple of months ago, and they had a great African/African-American exhibit. And there was some artists there I'd never even seen before. Yeah. And their work was very powerful. Yeah. And the thing that I always say is that all this stuff that you see around you as a creative person informs what I try to do with my next film. Yeah. Always informs me, you know. And sometimes you don't even know it's conscious, it's unconscious, you know. And that's an important thing to sort of keep yourself, you know, open to. You know. Nice.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like when people are creating, I'm not an artist. I'm an appreciative artist and collector of work, but I do feel like the ancestors speak to artists and creative people. So what they're doing is not new. What you're doing is just bringing that forward in your practice. So however you shape it, they're telling you what they want you to know now about what's happening and where you fit into that. And so I think that your work does that for us. So I want to ask you too about technology. You know, there's a lot going on now. And so how has technology changed the way you approach visual storytelling? And what should young artists be paying attention to?
First of all, I would say I started in this business when I cut film, physically cut film on moviolas and then on Steenbecks. And then in the 90s, I transitioned to nonlinear machines like the Avid and now Final Cut and Premiere. And the thing that's been amazing about this technological transition is that you can try so many more things now so quickly, you know, as an editor, as a filmmaker, that you could still do those things when you cut film, but now the speed at which you can do them is really transformative, you know. And if you're up to it, you know, and there's a lot of young people who understand this computer technology even more than I do, you know, you can try so many things creatively because of the access of the technology now, you know. And now we're dealing with AI, and it's, you know, and it's got its ups and it's got its downside. But the upside to AI too, and I saw this with something my son did, was that you can create things that initially you couldn't create so quickly with artificial intelligence that you can do now. You know, writing scripts, creating voiceover, extending voiceover. It's a little tricky, AI, but it's something that you got to embrace to a degree. I mean, so I always say my comment is always keep yourself open to all the changing technologies in this film and television world, because they will impact your work in creative ways. And so sometimes in negative ways, but you try to find the positive with these new technologies.
Do you have anything that concerns you about the creative process today, given AI and given some of the, I'm going to use the word censor, but not censor, censoring of what's happening specifically as it's related to our community?
Well, the concern that I have is that, you know, because of the technology, things can be manipulated in a way that can be negative in terms of our community. So you have to be very, very mindful of what you're looking at and listening to, you know, when you're on TikTok or you're on X, you know, because manipulation is much easier to do now. I mean, people can create voices and create stories and create characters that never existed. So you just have to be mindful and pay attention to what's being presented to you, you know, and keep your antennas high up so you don't just accept everything you hear or see.
So is there any work you would like to do or anyone you would like to work with in the future?
You know, I'm working on 2 films now. I'm working on a film about, as I mentioned, about the Lorraine Motel and the history of Lorraine Motel before Dr. King's assassination and how it got transformed after Dr. King's assassination into the National Civil Rights Museum. But I'm also in post-production on a feature-length documentary about Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Okay. And I had an opportunity to go to South Africa last year twice to interview people about the Archbishop. And we're trying to tell a story that just doesn't look at him as this man who was such a major force in dismantling apartheid in South Africa, but he was a global figure who dealt, you know, who was focused on other issues, you know, like women's rights issues, like what was happening, what's going on in Palestine and Israel, you know, the issues of hunger, you know. So, you know, we try to tell a story that's going to be more enveloping in terms of who he was. And I'm always still looking for filmmakers, young filmmakers who bring projects to me and challenge me to step, you know, outside of my comfort zone as a filmmaker.
Okay. So I'm curious to know when you know something is done. Like, is it?
You never know.
Okay.
It's only done. Here's the thing, Antoinette. It's done when you run out of money, or you have a deadline.
Gotcha.
If you got a deadline or you run out of money, then you know you got to get it done.
Okay.
If you don't have a deadline and you don't run out of money, you can keep working on a film forever. Look at Max Roach.
I was gonna say that was, and that was a great one, by the way, because I did see that one. So,
yeah.
So do you continue? Would you say I ran out of money, but when I get some more money, I know what else I'd like to add to that story, so it becomes a part 2, or you kind of move on completely?
Well, usually I've been fortunate that I've worked on films where there is deadlines and the money has run out, so I got to finish them. And except for Max Roach, I don't think I ever spent that long on a film. I mean, the longest I've filmed a film since, other than that, maybe 4 years, 3 years, which is my clock is ticking. That's too long now.
There's so much happening right now. I'm sure. I know you've got. It says I'm on your IMDb, by the way, and it does say that you have 4 things up and coming: Katrina, Come Hell or High Water, Rediscovering Kate Crew, The Price, and Counting the Ballots, all within 2025, and some have no year next to them. So you've got quite still additional work to do.
Always.
But thinking about what's happening, I'm not trying to get political, but there are a lot of things that are influencing how we do what we do, how we move. Are you seeing, feeling, and experiencing some other stories that you might want to tell out of today's environment?
Listen, if someone can give me some money to look at the political and social landscape in America, I would jump on it and do it immediately.
Gotcha.
But the challenge that we're facing as documentary filmmakers with these streamers and production companies is that they're gun shy.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump and his administration has put a stranglehold on people being creative. I mean, they're trying to dismantle the National Endowment of the Arts and National Endowment of the Humanities. Yeah. Look what they're trying to do to the Department of Education. Look what they're doing with taking money from universities like Columbia. I mean, they're making it much more difficult to be able to speak out. Yeah. And that's someone who's trying to create an oligarchy. So not democracy.
But we know people like you who've done us a great service by preserving the stories of those who created and made space for us to be seen and heard and feel the experiences from the 60s all the way up to now. I mean, only because of their experience have we been able to build on that. Wow. And now we're in a box and we're in a very interesting place. But with all that we have to offer creatively, we will hopefully continue to see those stories. It may not be on the broader, wider scale that we may have once hoped, but they need to be told. And I'm sure through your influence and all that you've done and shared so far, there'll be more stories coming from you.
I'm trying. I'm always trying.
And it will happen. So if someone were to get in touch with you, is there a website, someplace that we should be looking to get in touch with you?
You can share my email, folks. It's sampollard@me.com.
Okay. Thank you for that. So any final message you would like to give to the community at large?
Yeah, here's my final message. For those who are aspiring to tell our stories, be it on paper or on computers or as filmmakers, be focused, be tenacious, and never give in to the powers that want to destroy who we are.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank the audience for hanging in there with us and listening to, and you're sharing all of your stories. And I did put the link to your IMDb so they could see clips and trailers of the work that you've done, the projects, and they would probably be amazed if they've never been there to see just how much work you've done, and that can experience it now by going to actually see it on either YouTube or Prime Video or Netflix. It's available, and highly support that. We also want to encourage anyone who was not familiar with the Baltimore Museum of Art, which I'm not sure who that would be, that they would actually come and check us out, as well as the Joshua Johnson Council, which Rose mentioned earlier, is one of the oldest African-American affiliate groups. And we do meet on the second Thursday of the month, except during the summer. And we love hosting people who have a powerful story to tell, like you, Mr. Pollard. And we hope this will not be the last time we see you, that you will come back and share your story with us again sometime in the future. So
it was my pleasure.
I thank you so much. And I will also thank our audience for joining us tonight, and hope they go back on YouTube and rewatch this again after, because I'm going to have to go back and watch some of those films now that I've talked to you and see how you put the stories together, see if I see something different. So again, thank you so much for all that you shared with us.
My pleasure, Antoinette. Have a good night, folks.
You do the same. I bid you a good night all.